Welcome to Dark Hour Tales. Tonight's tale is the Watchtower. Ryan Cole had been working at Granite Peak for 23 days before he saw the light on Hollow Ridge. Until then, the job had been almost exactly what he wanted. Granite Peak Lookout stood on a steel frame 40 feet above a rocky summit in western Montana, high enough that the mountains seemed to spread beneath it rather than around it. On clear mornings, Ryan could see ridge after ridge disappearing into the blue distance, while thousands of acres of lodgepole pine, Douglas fir, and spruce filled the valleys below. Afternoon storms could be watched traveling towards him half an hour before they arrived, and sometimes golden eagles passed so close to the tower that Ryan could see individual feathers moving in the wind. At 28, Ryan had spent enough time explaining the job to friends that he had stopped trying to make it sound more complicated than it was. Most days, he watched the landscape for smoke, recorded weather observations, checked bearings with the firefinder mounted in the center of the cabin, and reported anything unusual to the ranger station. He maintained the tower, cleaned the solar panels, checked batteries, and logged lightning strikes after storms. Supplies arrived every week or two depending on road conditions, and otherwise Ryan saw nobody. He liked that part. This was his second season as a lookout, although his first at Granite Peak, and after years of seasonal conservation work, he had discovered that he was unusually comfortable with long stretches of his own company. There was no tragedy behind his decision to spend the summer on a mountain. Ryan had an environmental science degree, a collection of temporary jobs behind him, and no particular idea what he wanted to commit the next decade of his life to. His mother had suggested that disappearing into the wilderness for 4 months was simply an elaborate way of avoiding the question. Ryan had pointed out that avoidance rarely came with a salary and a view like this. The arrangement suited him, and although there were evenings when he missed restaurants, reliable internet, and conversations that did not involve wind direction, he had never once felt frightened by the isolation. His main contact with the outside world came through Dana Whitaker at Black Pine Ranger Station. Dana was 46, had worked for the Forest Service for more than 20 years, and spoke over the radio with the relaxed impatience of someone who had already dealt with 3 problems before breakfast. Their morning check-ins covered temperature, visibility, wind, and any developing fire activity, but on quiet evenings their conversations sometimes wandered. It was during one of those conversations that Ryan first asked about the old structure visible across the valley. Through binoculars, it looked like a small dark box balanced on the summit of a distant ridge. Dana told him it was Hollow Ridge Lookout and that it had not been staffed since the late 70s. When Ryan asked why it was still standing, Dana replied that nobody was particularly enthusiastic about hauling half a building down from a mountain nobody used anymore. The old access road had washed out in several places. The structure itself was considered unsafe, and Dana advised him to admire it from 7 miles away, rather than developing any romantic ideas about hiking across to explore it. Ryan laughed and assured her that climbing the staircase to Granite Peak several times a day already provided all the adventure he required. 3 weeks later, on a warm evening near the end of August, Ryan was sitting beside the western window with a paperback and a mug of coffee that had gone cold when he noticed a light inside Hollow Ridge. Sunset had almost disappeared behind the mountains, leaving only a thin red band above the horizon, and the forest below had become one enormous dark shape. Hollow Ridge was usually difficult to distinguish once daylight faded, but that evening a tiny yellow-white point shone clearly from the summit. Ryan put down his book and watched it for a while. Nothing about the light frightened him. People went places they were not supposed to go all the time, and an adventurous hiker deciding to spend a night inside an abandoned fire lookout made considerably more sense than anything sinister. He retrieved his binoculars and focused on the distant ridge. The remaining daylight was too weak to reveal much, but the glow appeared to be coming from inside the old cabin rather than from a campsite nearby. Ryan watched for movement and saw none. Eventually he returned to his book, occasionally glancing towards Hollow Ridge until the light disappeared roughly 40 minutes later. He mentioned it to Dana during the following morning's radio check. She confirmed that nobody from the Forest Service was working at Hollow Ridge and agreed that hikers were the most likely explanation. Ryan told her he was fairly certain someone had been inside the tower, and Dana promised to mention it because the structure was officially closed to the public. She also reminded him that reaching the ridge was not a 10-minute drive, and that unless somebody appeared to be in danger, nobody was going to launch an urgent expedition because a hiker had ignored a sign. Ryan agreed, looked across at the empty structure in the morning sunlight, and thought no more about it until evening. The following night he checked Hollow Ridge before the sun had fully set, although he told himself it was only curiosity. The ridge was empty. Ryan cooked pasta on the propane stove, cleaned the pan, and completed his evening log. When he looked again after darkness had settled, the light had returned. He raised the binoculars and watched it remain steady for perhaps a minute before it disappeared. A few seconds later it returned, vanished again, and then reappeared. At first Ryan assumed somebody was moving in front of a lantern, but the intervals soon became too regular. He lowered the binoculars and began counting. There were 3 short flashes, a pause, 3 longer flashes, another pause, and then 3 short flashes again. Ryan knew enough emergency signaling to recognize SOS without needing to check the reference sheet stored with the tower equipment. His amusement disappeared immediately. He contacted Black Pine Ranger Station and told Dana he was receiving what appeared to be an SOS signal from Hollow Ridge. Her tone changed at once. She asked him to maintain visual contact while she checked whether any hikers, survey crews, or Forest Service personnel were known to be in the area. Radio traffic filled the cabin for several minutes while Ryan watched the signal repeat across the valley. Nobody was supposed to be there. There were no active crews on Hollow Ridge, no known research teams, and no permits that explained the presence of someone inside the abandoned lookout. Dana eventually told him that a response team could not safely approach Hollow Ridge in darkness. The quickest usable route involved miles of damaged road, followed by a difficult hike, and they would begin the approach after sunrise. When Ryan asked what happened if the person was injured, Dana assured him that they were taking the signal seriously, but firmly instructed him not to attempt the crossing himself. Ryan had no intention of doing so. 7 miles of mountainous wilderness in daylight was one thing. Attempting it alone at night because a stranger was flashing a lamp was another. While they were speaking, the SOS stopped. Ryan watched the distant ridge for nearly a minute before the light began flashing again in a different pattern. He grabbed a notebook and started marking the sequence. His knowledge of Morse code was limited, but the emergency signaling reference provided the alphabet, and after several repetitions, he managed to translate the message. "Can you see me?" Ryan read the words twice before telling Dana. She asked whether he had any way to respond, and Ryan looked towards the powerful signal lamp mounted near the window. He positioned it towards Hollow Ridge, checked the reference sheet, and sent a simple answer. "Yes." The distant light went dark for almost 30 seconds before returning with another message. Ryan translated it as, "Who are you?" He answered with his first name, sending Ryan across the valley, 1 letter at a time. Another pause followed, and then the person at Hollow Ridge asked, "Are you alone?" Ryan frowned at the notebook. The question was slightly strange, but not impossible to rationalize. Someone in difficulty might simply want to know how much help was available. He told Dana what had been asked, and when she agreed that it was unusual, but not necessarily alarming, Ryan sent yes. Hollow Ridge remained illuminated for several seconds after receiving his answer, and then went dark. No further signal came that night. In daylight, the abandoned lookout looked incapable of producing anything. Ryan studied it through binoculars after sunrise and could make out weathered timber, broken windows, and a section of exterior walkway that appeared to sag away from the building. There was no visible tent, no smoke, and no person moving anywhere around the summit. A Forest Service crew attempted to reach Hollow Ridge that afternoon, but discovered that part of the old access road had washed out more severely than expected. Dana told Ryan they would try a northern approach the following day. During the conversation, Ryan asked how long Hollow Ridge had been abandoned. Dana thought the final season had been 1978 and initially remembered the last lookout as someone named Michael Trent. Ryan asked whether anything unusual had happened before the closure, and Dana laughed at his sudden interest in local history before admitting that she vaguely remembered hearing about an incident years earlier. She could not recall the details and said most of the old lookouts had closed for perfectly ordinary financial reasons anyway, but she promised to ask around. The light returned shortly after 10 that night. Ryan had been waiting for it, and the first message made him uncomfortable before he had even finished translating it. Ryan. There was nothing impossible about whoever was across the valley remembering his name, yet seeing it emerge one flash at a time from a mountain 7 miles away felt strangely intimate. Ryan answered with hello, and the response came quickly. Who are you? Ryan frowned. They had already asked that question the previous night. He signaled, you know my name, and received no answer. After waiting, he tried a question of his own and asked, who are you? The distant light remained steady for several seconds before flashing a single name. David. Ryan wrote it down and asked whether David was injured. The answer was no. When Ryan asked why he was at Hollow Ridge, nothing came back. He tried asking whether David had a radio and received another no. Then, before Ryan could send anything else, Hollow Ridge asked, can you help me? Ryan replied that rangers were coming. The person immediately asked when, and Ryan answered tomorrow. Hollow Ridge remained dark for so long afterwards that he assumed the conversation had ended. Then the light returned and flashed 2 words. Too late. Nothing else appeared before midnight. Dana contacted Ryan before the scheduled morning check-in. She told him that she had found the name of the last permanent lookout assigned to Hollow Ridge, and when Ryan asked whether it was David, the silence on the radio lasted long enough to make him regret the question. Dana asked how he knew the name. Ryan looked at the notebook beside him and replied, he told me. The man was David Mercer, 26 years old when he disappeared from Hollow Ridge in August 1978. His truck had remained parked near the old trailhead. His personal belongings and food were still inside the lookout, and search teams had spent 9 days covering the surrounding wilderness without finding him. There had been no confirmed fall, no evidence that he had deliberately hiked out, and no body. The case had never been solved. Ryan stared across the valley while Dana spoke. In the morning sun, Hollow Ridge looked utterly deserted. He suggested that somebody might know the story and be using David's name as part of an elaborate prank, and Dana agreed that it was possible. Ryan asked her to get someone into the tower as soon as she could. Dana assured him they were already trying. Later that afternoon, she contacted him again. She had been going through archived material at the district office and discovered that there was more to David Mercer's disappearance than she had remembered. Granite Peak had also been staffed in 1978 by a lookout named Charles Vance. During the nights before David disappeared, Charles reported seeing lights from Hollow Ridge, and the 2 towers had communicated using signal lamps. Dana began reading from Charles's daily log. Hollow Ridge had first signaled, "Can you see me?" and Granite Peak had replied, "Yes." Hollow Ridge then asked, "Who are you?" to which Charles answered with his own name. Ryan slowly opened the notebook containing his conversation from 2 nights earlier. When Dana continued and read the next question, "Are you alone?" Ryan interrupted her. He told her that he had received exactly the same messages in exactly the same order. Dana asked whether he had told anyone the full sequence before now. Ryan had not. He had reported the SOS and summarized the conversation, but nobody at the ranger station had been given a word-for-word transcript. Dana stopped treating the historical record as an interesting coincidence. It took almost an hour for photographs of the old report to reach Ryan's phone through the weak data connection. Charles Vance's handwriting was cramped but readable. Some of the conversation differed from Ryan's, while other sections matched closely enough to be disturbing. Hollow Ridge had asked for help. Charles had promised that assistance would come. Then the exchange became fragmented and difficult to follow. One line caught Ryan's attention. According to the report, Charles eventually signaled, "What can see me?" Ryan stared at the sentence. He had never sent those words. The response from Hollow Ridge had been, "Do not let it know where you are." Farther down the page, another message instructed Charles to turn off your light. According to the report, Hollow Ridge went completely dark shortly afterwards. David Mercer disappeared that night, while Charles Vance survived and resigned from the Forest Service within the week. Ryan read the pages twice. When evening came, he deliberately switched on every light in Granite Peak. It was partly stubbornness, and partly an attempt to prove to himself that a 48-year-old report was not going to dictate how he behaved. The cabin glowed warmly above the surrounding forest, while the valley disappeared into darkness. Hollow Ridge lit up shortly after 10. The first message was Ryan. Ryan ignored it. The name repeated several times, but he remained at the desk without touching the signal lamp. Eventually, the message changed to help, followed by, "It is here," and then "please." Ryan resisted for as long as he could. Someone might genuinely be trapped on that mountain. A person who knew the history of Hollow Ridge could have found David Mercer's name in an archive or newspaper report, and however elaborate the situation seemed, Ryan could not completely dismiss the possibility that there was a frightened human being asking for help. He switched on the signal lamp and asked, "What is there?" Hollow Ridge remained dark for several seconds before answering, "It watches the light." Ryan remembered the historical report beside him. Without consciously deciding to repeat it, he sent the most obvious question he could think of. "What can see me?" His hand stopped over the controls as soon as the final letter left Granite Peak. Those exact words had been written by Charles Vance in 1978. Ryan stepped backwards from the lamp. Hollow Ridge replied, "Do not let it know where you are." Ryan looked around his cabin. Every window reflected warm yellow light, and for the first time he considered how Granite Peak must look from below after dark. During daylight, the tower gave him an unobstructed view of the wilderness. At night, illuminated on top of a mountain, it became a beacon visible from miles away. The next message arrived. "Turn off your light." Ryan switched off the ceiling fixture, the desk lamp, and every equipment screen that could safely be darkened. His own reflection faded from the glass until the cabin seemed to disappear around him. Across the valley, Hollow Ridge flashed another message. Too late. The light paused before delivering one final sentence. "It can see you now." Hollow Ridge went dark. Ryan remained standing beside the desk, listening to the ordinary movements of the tower in the wind. 5 minutes passed without anything happening, then 10. He began to feel the first embarrassed relief that perhaps he had allowed a bizarre sequence of coincidences to frighten him. Then something touched one of the steel supports beneath the cabin. The sound was light, no more than metal contacting metal, but Ryan knew the normal noises of Granite Peak well enough to recognize something unfamiliar. A second sound came from the opposite side of the structure a few moments later. It was not the heavy impact of an animal running into a support or the irregular movement of branches in the wind. It sounded almost deliberate, as though something below was testing the tower. Ryan contacted Dana and explained what had happened. She listened without interruption before telling him that worsening weather had prevented the team from reaching Hollow Ridge, and that another crew was now heading towards Granite Peak. They were still several hours away. Dana then told him she had found the remainder of Charles Vance's statement. Charles had reported metallic noises beneath Granite Peak on the same night David Mercer disappeared. He had also heard footsteps on the exterior staircase. Ryan asked what Charles had done, and Dana told him that he had switched off every light, remained inside the cabin, and waited until sunrise. Shortly before dawn, the sounds had stopped. While Dana was speaking, the first stair below Ryan creaked. He turned towards the door. After a long pause, another stair groaned under weight. Ryan lowered his voice and told Dana that something was climbing the tower. She instructed him to lock the cabin, stay inside, and keep the lights off. Ryan assured her that the door was already secured and that he had no intention of leaving. Another stair creaked, then another. The sound stopped somewhere below the upper platform. Ryan stood in the center of the dark cabin and tried to judge the distance. He considered using the flashlight beside his bed, but remembered the message from Hollow Ridge and left it untouched. For several minutes, nothing moved. The radio crackled. Dana's voice called his name. Ryan lifted the handset and answered, but no response followed. Static filled the speaker, and when he tried again, the interference briefly cleared enough for another voice to emerge. "Can you see me?" Ryan stared at the radio. The voice was too faint for him to tell whether it belonged to Dana, a man, or simply static arranging itself into something his frightened mind recognized as speech. It repeated the question once more. "Can you see me?" Ryan switched the radio off. The cabin became silent again. 3 slow knocks sounded beneath the floor. Ryan moved away from the center of the room. The windows surrounding him reflected almost nothing, and outside was a depthless black expanse, where mountains, trees, and sky had merged together. Another stair creaked somewhere below, but Ryan could no longer tell whether the sound was getting closer or farther away. Then the light on Hollow Ridge returned. Ryan almost felt relieved to see it. He did not answer. Instead, he took the notebook and translated the signal as it repeated across the valley. "Do not answer." A second message followed. "I am not David." Ryan read the words twice. If whoever had been signaling from Hollow Ridge was not David, then the name had been a lie. He began wondering whether David Mercer had ever sent any of the messages in 1978, or whether Charles Vance had simply assumed he was communicating with the man assigned to the opposite tower. Perhaps David had already disappeared before the lights began. Perhaps the person, or whatever was producing them, had used David's identity because it was the name Charles expected. Another message began flashing. "Do not look down." Ryan felt an immediate urge to approach the window and look beneath the tower. He forced himself to remain where he was. A board creaked on the exterior walkway. The sound was no longer beneath him. Something had reached the top. Ryan kept his eyes on Hollow Ridge while slow pressure moved along the wooden walkway outside the western windows. He saw no silhouette and no shape passing through the darkness. The boards simply creaked one after another as though supporting weight. The movement stopped beside the door. The handle lowered slightly. Ryan watched it from several feet away. It returned to position, then moved again. He thought of Charles Vance sitting inside the same cabin in August 1978, surrounded by the same windows and listening to something test the same door. Whether Charles had understood what was happening or had simply spent the rest of his life refusing to discuss it, Ryan could not know. Hollow Ridge sent one more message. "Stay dark." Ryan obeyed. For the next 2 hours, Granite Peak produced sounds he would never afterwards describe with certainty. Sometimes he believed something was walking around the exterior platform. At other times, the stairs creaked from somewhere below. Once he heard a faint dragging sound against one of the steel supports, slow enough to resemble fingers moving along metal, although he knew that comparison came from imagination rather than evidence. Nothing struck the windows or attempted to force the door. The restraint made the waiting worse because whatever was outside seemed perfectly willing to remain there. Shortly after 4 in the morning, the radio switched itself on. Ryan heard the click from across the cabin. Static filled the speaker. He had turned the unit off himself. Dana's voice emerged clearly enough that Ryan almost answered. She called his name and told him the rescue team was close. Then she instructed him to turn on the tower lights so they could locate him. Ryan took one step towards the controls before stopping. Dana knew about Charles Vance's report. She had specifically told him to stay dark. The voice repeated the instruction, asking him to turn on the lights. Ryan stepped away. Static swallowed Dana's voice. Then Ryan heard himself speaking through the radio. "Can you see me?" The transmission ended. Outside, the boards beside the door creaked once more. A moment later, the staircase began to groan, one step at a time, as whatever had reached the top appeared to descend. Ryan remained in darkness until the eastern sky began to change. At first, the black outside the windows merely became less complete. Then mountain silhouettes returned against deep blue and individual ridges slowly separated from one another. Trees emerged below the tower. Ryan waited until sunlight touched the upper windows before switching the radio on. Dana answered immediately. Ryan asked where she was, and she told him the crew was roughly 40 minutes away. He almost asked whether it was really her before deciding there was no answer she could give that would prove anything over the radio. He finally looked outside. The exterior walkway was empty. The staircase was empty. Nothing beneath the tower appeared disturbed, and there were no tracks or marks that could explain what he had heard. Across the valley, Hollow Ridge stood beneath the morning sun. Ryan examined it through binoculars. The old lookout looked exactly as it always had, with broken windows, weathered timber, and no sign that anybody had occupied it for decades. Ryan did not stay at Granite Peak another night. Dana arrived with two Forest Service employees shortly after 8. She took one look at him and did not try to convince him otherwise. They gathered his personal belongings, secured the tower, and descended together. No official explanation accounted for everything that happened. Trespassers at Hollow Ridge remained possible despite the difficulty of reaching it. Radio interference might have explained some of what Ryan heard, and exhaustion could account for other details. Nobody offered a convincing explanation for a sequence of Morse code messages matching a document written in 1978. Ryan stopped asking. He stayed with a friend in Missoula for several days while deciding whether to accept another seasonal assignment. He had begun convincing himself that leaving Granite Peak was enough when Dana called and asked him to come to the district office. When Ryan arrived, Dana was waiting in a small records room with Charles Vance's file open on the table. She told him that something had changed. There was another page attached to the statement, and Dana was certain it had not been there when she first reviewed the file. Ryan asked whether it could have come from another copy or been misfiled. Dana had already checked. The page matched the rest of the statement, including the paper, typewriter, and archive markings. As far as the district office was concerned, it had always been there. Ryan sat opposite her and began reading. Charles described remaining inside Granite Peak until shortly before dawn. He recorded the same metallic sounds beneath the tower, the same footsteps on the stairs, and unexplained interference through the radio. The account matched what Ryan already knew until an entry timed at 4:46 a.m. Charles reported seeing another light. It was not coming from Hollow Ridge. According to his statement, Hollow Ridge had been completely dark. The new light appeared on another ridge across the valley, in a place where Charles knew there was no active lookout. As the sky began to brighten, he was able to distinguish the outline of a tower around the light. Charles described it as Granite Peak. Ryan read the paragraph again. Charles Vance had been sitting inside Granite Peak while looking across the valley at another Granite Peak. The report continued. The impossible second tower began signaling shortly before sunrise, and Charles recorded the Morse sequence at the bottom of the page. I am not Ryan. Ryan stared at the sentence until the letters began to lose meaning. Dana quietly reminded him that Charles Vance had written the statement in August 1978. Ryan did not need reminding. Charles could not have known his name. He closed the folder and asked whether anyone had returned to Granite Peak since he left. Dana told him no. Hollow Ridge had not yet been inspected either because the district was waiting for helicopter access. Ryan stood and told her he wanted to go. Dana remained seated for a moment before telling him there was one more thing. A patrol ranger had driven through Black Pine the previous night and stopped on the Western Service Road because he thought somebody had reopened Granite Peak. From several miles away, he had seen a light inside the cabin. Ryan reminded her that the tower had been shut down and asked whether the batteries had been disconnected. Dana confirmed that the interior lighting had been disabled before they left. The ranger had recorded a short video. Dana placed her phone on the table and played it. Granite Peak was barely visible against the dark mountain, but a tiny yellow-white light shone from the cabin. Ryan watched it disappear and return in a deliberate sequence. There were 3 short flashes, followed by 3 long flashes, and then 3 short flashes again. SOS. The light remained steady for several seconds before another sequence began. Ryan watched the first few flashes and felt the same cold certainty he had experienced on the mountain. He no longer needed a Morse reference sheet to understand them. The message was asking a question. Can you see me?